So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear colleagues. Thank you very much for coming here tonight for this panel discussion, which we are going to lead with Ms. Angela Kane. We're very privileged that she accepted the invitation to talk about prudent leadership, actually, on the 60th anniversary of the historic speech delivered by JFK at the commencement ceremony at the American University, where another discussant has studied here, Professor Vanitopoulos. Ms. Kane has spent most of her life working for the UN, both in New York and in other areas. And her former position was that she was High Representative for Disarmament, and Undersecretary General for Management and Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. She has been a professor at Sciences Po for International Affairs. She has also had a very close relationship with Tsinghua University and the Schwarzman scholars in Beijing. And she's the chair of the UN University Council in Tokyo and Regional Council on the Korean Peninsula. Ms. Kane is a senior advisor to the Nuclear Threat Initiative, or NTI, and she has served as the NTI Some Non-Distinguished Fellow between 21 and 22, supporting NTI's work on global threat reduction. Ms. Angela Kane will give the keynote talk, and she will be also in the partnership of the distinguished experts we have here with us tonight, Professor Athanasios Platias from Piraeus University, the top expert in strategy in the Greek academia and international relations theory. He has a very long CV. Everybody has a long CV around the table, so I will not go into detail about their CVs, but I would like to stress that he's been more than once chair of the Department of International European Studies at the University of Piraeus. Before joining the University of Piraeus, he was teaching at Pantheon University, and he's very familiar with this place here. And I see very familiar faces around the table, and not only on the table, also in the audience, people that have worked at Pantheon University. Professor Platias has written extensively on many issues about international relations theory, and he's very well known for his studies on Thucydides and other thinkers from other civilizations like Sun Tzu, about whom he has also written a very important book. Professor Platias has also visited the Tsinghua University and has also been a scholar and fellow at MIT, at Harvard University, Ford Foundation, and he holds a PhD and MA from Cornell University in New York State. Professor Vanitopoulos, he is professor at Pantheon University, the Department of International, European, and Area Studies. And currently, he's also the director of the Konstantinos Karamanlis Foundation. He used to be the general director of the Konstantinos Karamanlis Institute for Democracy, another foundation, think tank of new democracy. And he was also a minister in a very difficult period for Greece between 2011 and 2015. He was Minister of Education, Religious Affairs, and Sports. And he was also a holder of the Konstantinos Karamanlis Chair at Tufts University before joining the Konstantinos Karamanlis Foundation as a director. Professor Vanitopoulos, as I said before, has studied at Pantheon University, where he took his BA and then he received his MA and his PhD at American University in Washington, D.C., where this very speech we're going to talk about today was delivered 60 years ago by then President JFK, and left a very important mark on our thinking about nuclear disarmament. Professor Vanitopoulos has written extensively in Greek and English. I'm also not going into detail about his CV, but He is preparing right now some new publications about the creation of the Greek state, about the Ukrainian war, which is going to be one of our subjects, and other issues. Then I'm turning to Professor Chang, Sin-Che Chang. Good, I had it, I got it. He's a professor of international relations and associate dean at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's associate dean at Tsinghua Shenzhen International Graduate School and executive director at the Center for Hong Kong and Macau Studies of Tsinghua University. He's also the secretary of Asian Universities Alliance, and previously Professor Chang has been a resident scholar for Carnegie and Tsinghua Center for Global Politics, director of the MA program on Chinese foreign policy. He holds in political science, PhD in political science from Yale University. So different continents, not just different countries here, come together. Last but not least, doctor, or I don't know whether I should say professor, Vasilis Trigas. Gradually. He's a postdoctoral teaching fellow right now at Tsinghua University. He's much more than that. He's a bridge, as we said previously, between Greece, China, and other countries, as he is very active in the China program running for Greece with certain organizations. He previously was a research fellow at Tsinghua University, and he was also a non-resident Hunter Fellow and Young Leader at the Pacific Forum of CSIS. He's done a lot of research in many areas. He has published widely in distinguished journals like Journal of Contemporary China, Political Science Quarterly, and others. And he has received his PhD at Tsinghua University, where he was also an Onassis scholar. Now, after this short introduction, I would also like to thank very much Ms. Sinofenduli, who is hosting us here today at this wonderful place in Plaka, and for organizing the entire event, which is a co-organization. We're very happy for that, between this, the Institute for International Relations of Pantheon University, and the Council for International Relations, Greece. Thank you very much, for everything. And let's now start with the keynote talk of Ms. Angela Kane. We're very much looking forward to listening to it.
Thank you very much, Konstantina, and thank you for this very generous introduction. I do want to add also my thanks to the Institute of International Relations of Greece and also the Council for International Relations of Greece for having organized this and inviting me here. And I'm delighted to see Professor Platias again, who I last met online while we were still Zooming all of our events. And so I'm very pleased to actually meet in person. And I want to talk about the speech about John F. Kennedy that he gave 60 years ago. And so when Dr. Trikas mentioned the theme to me some weeks ago, I was kind of thinking, now, why on earth should we commemorate the speech of an American president here in Athens? But I realized that Athens represents an immense symbolism about very prudent leadership. And that's really what we have to think about. And for me, it feels really lovely to be here in Athens, on the hills of the Acropolis, talking about the urgency of prudent leadership in a turbulent geopolitical world, or sovereign leadership, as the Greek world goes. And as you've heard, I'm basically a practitioner all of my life of diplomacy. I've been involved in negotiations, I have headed departments, I've been in political settlements, and so forth. So now, all of a sudden, I'm in a world of leadership, in a world of study, in a world of learned leaders. And I think it's a wonderful feeling to be here with all of you here. Now, Athens had been the incubator of prudent leaders from Solon and Clisthenes to Themistocles to Pericles, and even in the Roman age of Hadrian. And that was one of the most successful Roman emperors who had fallen in love with the city and was educated here. And in fact, just a few days ago, while I was reading Thucydides' masterpiece, The History of the Peloponnesian War, and that was clearly in an attempt to refresh my memory of the Greek classics, I came across Pericles' last speech, which sadly is not as famous as Pericles' funeral oration, but in my view is much more significant when it comes to the virtues of leadership and the consequentiality of agency in navigating the ship of state. And that is really, when you think about it, when you think about this very turbulent geopolitical world that we live in now, what does it take to stabilize the ship of state? In that last speech, Pericles stressed that the first step of leadership should be a clear vision about what the strategic goal should be. This must be followed, however, by the crucial second step, which requires communicative rationality. And that means the ability to persuade the people to unbendingly pursue that vision. If you have a great vision, but you are nonetheless unable to persuade others to follow that vision, then leadership fails because you simply will not be able to achieve that goal. And that in that last speech, the American University commencement address that JFK gave in 1963 was in the third year of his presidency. And if you think about it, it was just 4 months because his tragic assassination. And in it, Kennedy, the youngest president in US history, excelled in both having a lucid vision and brilliantly communicating it to both domestic and international audience. And of course, not only the audience, but it included very major decision makers. And JFK defined the strategic goal lucidly: coexistence among nuclear superpowers instead of relentless rivalry and an unending arms race that could take both sides into the nuclear abyss. After having defined the goal of strategic coexistence, JFK introduced the very manageable steps, and that meant arms control and strategic bilateral dialogue with the use of great oratory, which made other stakeholders share his visionary goals. Being in Athens, and we're here in the city that funded rhetoric as a study discipline, I must stress that part of JFK's immensely successful oratory, and that is the communicative rationality, included what the Greeks call anti-metaboly, and that is the repetition of words in transposed order. One such example from this commencement address is the following: let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And probably the signature JFK example of that Greek rhetorical tool is found in his presidential address that is extremely well known, and I think every one of you will have heard it, and that is, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And masterful rhetoric communicating JFK's vision was really crucial for the implementation of JFK's strategy for peace. So just after 2 months after this speech, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Nuclear Partial Test Ban Treaty. The treaty outlawed nuclear testing in the atmosphere, but allowed continued testing underground. Inarguably not a perfect treaty, but the deal, however, demonstrated the validity of JFK's belief that peace is a process. And we must remember that peace is a process. In JFK's own words, he said, there is no magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be a product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, it must not be static, but it must change to meet the challenges of each new generation. For peace is a process, it's a way of solving problems. The Nuclear Partial Test Ban Treaty catalyzed further bilateral discussions between Washington and Moscow. It created, therefore, a process which unleashed a series of consequent arms control treaties that remain relevant to this very day. Some have since become defunct. Think, for example, of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which fell apart after the Bush administration abandoned it. But the most crucial of it all, the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, remains the unbending pillar of nuclear security. It is the most significant accomplishment of the Cold War era up until the discussion for nuclear disarmament, which I must stress, Kennedy also supported in 1963. He was a realist. He was the difficulties of disarmament, he was very clear-eyed about, but he again hoped that the process would actually take us there. So what about today? Where are we today? It's been 60 years since JFK's visionary speech for peace, as historians have framed the American University commencement address, which actually occurred on June 10th, 1963. Regrettably, however, today we have totally regressed. We've entered the terrifying zeitgeist that preceded JFK's speech for peace. Today, we are tragically closer to the strategic security environment that paved the escalatory events that led to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, a crisis we were all lucky to survive. JFK then put the probability of nuclear war as more than 50%. So it was luck, or was it fear of unleashing a nuclear catastrophe with severe and unpredictable consequences? So today, we may have already entered the path towards nuclear escalation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has fueled NATO's response. With NATO's coordination, individual NATO members have transferred significant military equipment to Ukraine, and the latest announcements include F-16s and longer-range missiles provided by the United Kingdom. Russian President Vladimir Putin has declared that the security of Russia, if it is at risk, then nukes could be used. So where exactly is the red line? Moreover, upping the ante, Russia has transferred nuclear weapons to Belarus, unraveling the post-1991 security order in Europe. Military budgets have expanded significantly, as we all know, so less butter and more weapons is now what we call the new normal. Things become even more complicated if one considers the case of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is Europe's largest nuclear power plant. It supplied 30% of Ukraine's electricity prior to Russia's invasion. Russian forces have had control of the nuclear power plant since March last year, while Ukrainian technicians continue to operate the facility. Shelling around the site, for which both Russia and Ukraine blame each other, have raised serious concerns about a possible nuclear catastrophe. Let us not forget Chernobyl in 1986. Let us remember Fukushima in 2011. The consequences of these nuclear accidents are still present and will be with us for a long time. Chernobyl and Fukushima were natural catastrophes, but this is the first time ever that a nuclear power plant is used as a weapon of war. A catastrophic accident in Zaporizhzhia can be orders of magnitude worse than either Chernobyl or Fukushima. The International Atomic Energy Organization confirmed that Zaporizhzhia's physical integrity had been what they called violated several times. And Director General Grossi, after another visit to the nuclear power plant in April, stated that the plant poses a major risk to nuclear safety and security. The UN Security Council held briefings on this issue, but without taking concrete action, as you can imagine, because Russia is a permanent member of the Council and has a veto right. So if there is a perfect case for inadvertent escalation into a major nuclear incident, look no further. This could be very well it. US and Russia relations will be on ice for a very long time. There will be no Russian pivot to the West. Mutual distrust now runs extremely deep. Arms control discussions, let alone good faith negotiations, are totally suspended. We have already entered an era of strategic instability reminiscent of the pre-1963 world, the Cuban crisis, which I've already mentioned. Transparency, risk reduction measures, other cooperative efforts are at a minimum or non-existent. The rupture of ties with Russia carries great risk for European and global security. There is a line down the middle of Europe, similar to what existed in the Cold War, with an empowered and cohesive NATO standing on one side, confronted by Russian buildup that defends its near abroad, or what it sees as its traditional sphere of influence. Given the dire conditions we are in, one of the priority areas has to be arms control, and especially in the nuclear field. We must once again achieve détente. In conditions of détente, nuclear weapons are not seen as weapons to be used. They are, in fact, unsuitable for battlefield use. Escalation, therefore, has to be avoided because it would lead to mutually assured destruction. Nuclear weapons under conditions of mutually assured destructions are mostly symbols. They are not weapons, but they are very powerful ones. Both powerful symbols and powerful weapons. But they should allow great powers to respect the core national interests of the other side and avoid conditions that would take them to nuclear war. Now, we know that the world has not witnessed the explosion of nuclear bombs since atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. But the appeal to acquire nuclear weapons continues to grow stronger, despite the Non-Proliferation Treaty's Article 6, which requires nuclear disarmament and eventual elimination, which was, of course, the ultimate goal of JFK's speech in 1963. To be sure, Article 6 in the NPT refers to disarmament for those nuclear powers that are accepted as such in the NPT. So the appeal to others, by others, to acquire nuclear weapons is against their NPT obligations. But the appeal for the acquisition of nuclear weapons gained strength after the collapse of the Budapest Memorandum that ensured Ukrainian sovereignty with Ukraine agreeing to return Soviet nuclear weapons stored on its territory to Russia. So the important question is how to lessen that appeal for nuclear proliferation. Would US extended deterrence be the most viable path? Would nuclear protection to Australia, South Korea, and Japan make those technologically capable nations unwilling to acquire nuclear weapons? I still think, however, that one should always consider the appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and other instruments to extend deterrence and attempt to reduce the nuclear component where possible. So while the nuclear taboo is still very strong, during the last year there has been erosion that we now think addressed by President Putin that he might use nuclear weapons against anyone trying to interfere in the Ukraine war were alarming. Not to speak about the occupation of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant mentioned earlier, holding it hostage to the very real risk of a nuclear accident. The statement of the G20 meeting in Bali in November last year, and Russia, of course, is still a member of the G20, so they participated in that meeting, was therefore very important because it came out by stating that, and I quote, the use or threat of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. And that was a welcome affirmation of the nuclear taboo. We need to see really many more high-level statements that condemn the threat of use of nuclear weapons from nuclear possessors as well as non-nuclear weapon states. But we also need to recall JFK's point in the commencement speech for peace that, and I quote, above all, while we, Western democracies, are defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or a collective death wish for the world. That was his quote. But avoiding an immediate nuclear conflagration does not ensure our long-term survival. The nuclear clock, the so-called doomsday clock, has been ticking ever closer to midnight. In the era of disruptive artificial intelligence, conventional prompt strike, increasing ICBM precision, potential weaponization of space, and massive expansion in both quantity and quality of nuclear arsenals, there's a pressing need for immediate arms control. Without arms controls in place, a new nuclear arms race will be more destabilizing than the arms race during the Cold War, which led the US and Russia to each develop more than 30,000 nuclear warheads with the capacity to destroy the whole world 100 times over. Just think about the destructive power of nuclear weapons. One of the largest US MIRV missiles could hold up to 10 warheads, each with a yield of around 300 kilotons. I mean, that's about the equivalent of 230 Hiroshima-type bombs. Just think about that. Russia has similar, if not more destructive weapons, and China is developing those too. Now add to this destructive power and supercharge it with artificial intelligence. We can't even imagine what it would be like. We still lack clear understanding of how AI operates and how AI could affect strategic stability. As states become increasingly scared of the viability of a successfully disarming first strike, they may switch their strategic doctrine to launch on warning, thus increasing the probability for a catastrophic era that will push the world to the nuclear end of history. This Terminator is a sci-fi scenario. And I don't know if you have ever seen the documentary of Stanislav Petrov from 1983. He saved the world by not retaliating a counterstrike, which turned out to be an era of the computers. So what actually now do great powers do to prevent this? Just look around and see how dire the situation is. The last bilateral treaty between the US and Russia, New START, would expire in 2026, 3 years from now. It's now been suspended by the Russian Federation due to concerns about compliance, transparency, predictability, exchange of information. None of this is practiced. No new bilateral talks, no negotiations are envisaged. There's no forum for dialogue between the US and Russia, no contact, no crisis communication channels, and this at a time of rising nuclear risks. No process of negotiations as JFK advocated. Nuclear arms control seems to have lost its place in the security landscape. But we also need to be mindful that a few weeks ago, the US published its annual intelligence threat assessment, which identified China as an unparalleled priority in technologically, politically, and militarily. So the US is in a dual containment mode against both China and Russia. China's strong cooperation with Russia is maintained in order to defend itself from the US, which China perceives as a state that aims to contain China and undermine its economic development. Therefore, for China, Russia is an important strategic power which bolsters China's effort to expand its security and project force across the Asia-Pacific region. So while in the Cold War, we had two powers with major nuclear arsenals, the US and the Soviet Union, we now have three major nuclear powers, United States, Russia, and China. Though China still has fewer nuclear weapons than the United States or Russia, Beijing is currently significantly expanding its nuclear arsenal, which is expected to quadruple between 2018 and 2030. At the same time, Beijing does not participate in nuclear negotiation, arguing that since its nuclear arsenal is still so much smaller compared to the US and Russia, then it's the other two powers that have the responsibility to reduce the size of their nuclear arsenals first. But of course, this is not a very good excuse in my eyes. Arms control is not only about the quantity of weapons, but quality too. In the era of AI and other disruptive technologies, non-communication among major powers could have detrimental effects on nuclear stability and the very survival of civilization. Remember, the clock is ticking closer to midnight, and complexity is much, much higher than in 1962, Cuba, or 63 when JFK gave a speech. Let me conclude by trying to imagine what would JFK say today in an effort to take us a step back from nuclear abyss, take us further away from midnight. As Jeffrey Sachs has beautifully put it, JFK's 1963 speech for peace was not based on idealism, but on realism. And I quote, "It attempted to transform our deepest aspirations for peace into practical realities." So the speech almost presented a method, a dream and do combination that soars with high vision and yet walks on earth with practical results. I think the first thing JFK would say today is that while we must break the hammerlock of fear and loathing, that we cannot again accept to live under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accidents or miscalculation or mere madness. And this is from JFK's UN address. And then JFK would clearly stress that, quote, "Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man or woman. And man or woman can be as big as she wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and they could do it again." But of course, none of this will happen automatically. It will require political grace and courage and communicative rationality. Peace, after all, as we now know, and as JFK said, is a process. Major powers will not miraculously resolve their differences and achieve perpetual peace, but they must strive to find a modus vivendi in a new and even more complex nuclear era. I think the best way to conclude is by directly quoting JFK in what I believe are the most important words of that speech that delivered almost to this very day 60 years ago. Perhaps the most important words in American diplomatic history or the diplomatic history of the Cold War. And he said, I quote, Let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. These are powerful words of a prudent, of the sovereign leaders, matched by the consequent deeds that make mortal life gentle. Let's commemorate this great speech and consider the difference that prudent leadership can make. We urgently need it in Europe and beyond. Thank you.
Dear Angela, thank you very much for this extraordinary speech and for linking it with the speech delivered by JFK over 60 years ago on June 10, 1963. You can actually read, watch, or listen to that speech on the JFK Library, National Library site or on other sites in the US. And these are the quotes that you mentioned are some of the very important, wise words he used in that speech. I keep from your talk, and I'll give the word immediately to Professor Avantopoulos, following the invitation here. I keep from your talk the stress that you gave, your focus on strategic instability, reminding of the pre-1963 landscape. This is something new. This is very radical, because for us who grew up in the 80s, we remember very clearly the fear we had of a nuclear disaster. And since you mentioned JFK, a man who looked into the abyss, this brings to us again those memories, and we realize how unstable the international environment is for our nuclear security feeling. You also talked about the destructiveness of modern nuclear weapons, and for the quality, not only the quantity of nuclear weapons that has to be addressed, and the fluid landscape of nuclear proliferation and nuclear agreements. The CTBT is, from a Heisenberg Treaty, is a very eloquent example, as well as the START agreement, so on and so forth. So now I would like to give the floor to Professor Avantopoulos to pose the first question. We are going to make a round with questions taken from comments from the discussants, and then we will open up the Q&A session with the audience. The methodology we're going to follow. Thank you. This is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Konstantina. I want to thank Vasilis that thought about the issue and was very instrumental in organizing this event, and also in this, and for facilitating this meeting today. It is obvious that this is a very important issue for a variety of reasons. If you look around the world, what is happening today, you will see that many regional powers are seeking nuclear proliferation, aspiring to become nuclear powers. So nuclear proliferation is an ever-present problem. And of course, we have the Putin regime with the nuclear saber-rattling, scaring the hell out of the world. So in that sense, the Kennedy speech is very timely. And I want to focus a little bit on the speech because I think it includes a lot of lessons for the problems that we're facing today. And obviously it stresses how important leadership and the qualities that should follow leadership for today. Qualities like to succeed in anarchy or Machiavellian virtue, rationality or prudence, if you will. How much wanted in our world today. Now, the speech itself was very carefully calculated by Kennedy in all of its phases. Kennedy very carefully chose the place. He targeted the audiences, and he picked the timing. And let me be more specific. The timing was very obvious. We were in the apogee of the Cold War, and we had just left behind us a very significant international crisis that brought the world into the brink of nuclear holocaust, nuclear catastrophe, and this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy was prudent enough to give the Soviets a safe-facing compromise with the decision to withdraw the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. So his prudence in handling the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was very evident from the very beginning. And the way he handled the crisis itself, the XCOM that he assembled with the best and the brightest, as Halberstam would later on write in his famous book, and the cautiousness that he exhibited throughout the crisis. Now, after the crisis, I think he took a calculated risk because he felt that this was a very important time that he should grasp to make an initiative for a better world. And so, in that sense, the timing was very carefully picked by Kennedy. The second was the venue. The American University was not the obvious choice, but I think it had two symbolisms on Kennedy's mind. First one, for those that know the United States, that was a Methodist college that was founded by a Methodist bishop in 1893, but was opened up by Woodrow Wilson in 1914, I believe, 1914, I'm right, yeah. Who was, of course, by far and foremost an idealist. At the same time, however, Dwight Eisenhower had founded the School of International Service in 1957 at the American University, and Dwight Eisenhower was a famous pragmatist. So the choice of the American University, which was not an obvious choice, was a choice with many symbolisms on the part of Kennedy. Symbolisms that were expressed throughout his speech, because he wanted to blend his idealist vision with pragmatic overtones, as we will see. And by the way, the place that Kennedy made his speech is very hard to miss. And in every orientation session, the American University immediately take you there. It's about the soccer field. So, you know, for those of us who play soccer all the time, it's a place that we looked at every day almost. And of course, we were taught about the speech. And so forgive me for highlighting some of the issues that we did highlight and adding some answers of my own. Now let's talk about the audiences. I think Kennedy had three audiences in his mind. First, the world at large. And to the world, he immediately outlined a very idealist vision. That was his vision. And that came in one of the early paragraphs of his speech. He said, what kind of a world do I want? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. That was an idealist version, an idealist vision, but Kennedy went immediately, he stressed why he gave this idealist vision about peace. Because he said, with the destructiveness of nuclear arms, one cannot think about war, let alone total war anymore. War with this destructiveness of the nuclear arsenals possessed by the two superpowers can mean the end of humanity. But then he made an effort to situate his idealism in a more functionalist edifice. Because he went along, as Angela Kane just outlined, to talk about the sum of many acts. And by that he meant he took a more practical approach, and he talked about a more feasible peace, depending not on a revolutionary change of human beings, but by change of human institutions. So he takes a more functionalist, a more institutionalist approach to a more practical peace, a peace that will be based on mutual tolerance. Now, his second audience are the Soviets. And there he tries to strike a very careful balance. He talks about the need for a candid perception of each other. As the Cuban Missile Crisis has taught us, misperceptions and perceptions played a very important role throughout the crisis, from the outset of the crisis until the very end of the crisis, the resolution of the crisis. And so Kennedy said, we need to take a candid look to each other. We need to tolerate each other. He goes on to say that we reject their system, we reject communism, but we cannot reject their achievements or their civilization. He talks and recognizes the Soviet losses throughout the Second World War. He talks about the realization of the mutually destructive force accumulated by the two powers. And he talks that both superpowers have a mutually deep interest on a just and genuine peace and in halting the arms race. He takes a very pragmatic look towards the Cold War, and he goes on to signal to the Soviets that the United States will relax the tension, but will not relax its guard. And in other words, it signals that the United States is not going to take a provocative, aggressive posture anymore towards the Soviet Union. She makes a very significant first step approaching the Soviets. His third audience is the ally. I need not remind you that we are the apex of the Cold War. We have a divided Europe, we have a divided Germany, and so Kennedy will take the extra mile to pacify any fears coming from Europe, Western Europe, or Westerly, that America will never abandon its allies. So he goes on to say that our allies and commitments, our alliances and commitments, such as Western Europe and Westerly, hold, and that no deal whatsoever with the Soviet Union will be made behind their back or at their expense. So he needs to pacify all his allies that we are not there abandoning you, trying to strike a secret deal with the Soviets behind or underneath the base. And then the third part of his speech is what Angela talked about, his proposals. He makes direct, very pragmatic and very incremental. The first one is establish a direct line so that we can avoid crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Direct line between the Pentagon or the White House and the Kremlin. Is that we want to engage the Soviets in Geneva as we have started the arms control agreement and the arms control discussions to limit the intensity of the arms race. And of course, his vision is that these arms control negotiations should lead us to a test ban treaty. The first major step that he takes is let's move towards a test ban treaty. And the second very important, I think, proposal that he makes is that the United States, it's almost a unilateral proposal, a unilateral approach that he takes in his speech when it comes to the United States commitment not to propose or conduct nuclear tests in the atmosphere. Of course, he adds that, we will do so long as other states don't do so, and so on and so forth. But he has made three very important proposals in his speech. Direct line, test ban treaty in the end of the negotiations, arms control negotiations, and also a unilateral commitment that we're not going to conduct any nuclear atmosphere tests and so on and so forth. And in that sense, I think, in the structure of the speech, by taking the place, by blending an idealist vision with very pragmatic overtones, and by addressing those three audiences, the world at large, the Soviet Union, and the United States allies, Kennedy has tried the impossible. And by impossible, I mean that he has struck a very delicate balance. He has transformed, in a sense, very lofty aspirations into very practical realities. And this is, I think, the power of his speech. And it shows us that how leadership qualities, such as those that were outlined by Angela, prudence, rationality, arete, virtue, are so needed and can take us the extra step towards establishing world peace. And I think in that sense, this speech is very timely if we take into consideration what is happening not only in Europe, but all over the world. Thank you.
Very much, Konstantinos. Now we're moving to Professor Athanasios Plakias. Professor Athanasios Plakias is a very well-known realist. And in order to say his words, I would like just to remind you that he said, I'm an idealist without illusions. How could an idealist without illusions bring us to Sophrosyne?
Well, first of all, I would like to say to the audience that we all had the privilege to listen to Angela Kane that really combines two different worlds, the academic world, that you could see from her lecture. I mean, he is a professor of international relations, but at the same time a practitioner. For 35 years, he has practiced the theory. Very few of us can bring this kind of experience, you know, the theory and the practice together. So it was word of wisdom, Angela, and really grateful. And it puts me in a very difficult position because I cannot disagree with anything that you said. So then I only have to highlight some of the issues that you raised. Okay, starting with blunt realism. I mean, Kennedy was talking to a class that had 50% possibility of being dead. As you said, he calculated that the possibility of the Cuban Missile Crisis that happened several months ago go into escalation, and therefore nobody would have lived in Washington was 50% or more. So somehow he was celebrating life, celebrating that the hell was not there. And how life was created with prudence. I mean, he played a chicken game. And in game theory, a typical chicken game, when the two sides are going directly against each other, the solution that the game theorists give in equilibrium, for example, is that one side will yield and the most aggressive, the most risk-taking part will prevail, because the side that will decide to step down, it will calculate that the benefits of being a loser is higher than being destroyed. A very dangerous game. But you see, game theory supposes rationality. And it's very difficult to bring rationality when you have huge organizations, emotions, and status into play. So he understood that. So he played the game of chicken and gave a different solution that game theorists will predict: compromise. Because actually, the Cuban Missile Crisis was not just space-saving, Konstantinos. It was a compromise. I mean, the Soviets withdrew the weapons from Cuba, and the functional equivalent was the withdrawing of weapons from Turkey that were targeting the Soviet Union. So he gave a compromise. But most importantly, in my mind, this speech represents an American theory of victory over the Soviets. Because essentially, he realized that there is no military solution. under mutual assured destruction, there is no way that the Americans would have prevailed. So he eliminated the military solution to this competition. And he said, you know, we are different systems, we are compete, but let's not do war. Well, that was very successful. The West managed to prevail by not using the military solution. Essentially, he reminded me of Archidamos. When he gave a speech to the Spartans before the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, he said to the Spartans, do we have a solution? I mean, can we win this war? What kind of war we can make? That's precisely what Kennedy said. There's no, we don't have a military solution. Therefore, let's look for other areas of competition. And he proved right, because the other area of competition, the West could prevail over the Soviets. Now, the most important thing to eliminate the military victory is to stabilize the competition and get out the possibility of inadvertent nuclear escalation. So with his speech, he started an area of arms control that went beyond Kennedy. I mean, even the conservatives, the Republicans that follow him, maintain that path. I mean, it's not only the hotline and the complicated treaty, it was, as you correctly said, the non-proliferation, the ABM treaty, SALT I, SALT II, STORM. So a whole infrastructure of treaties of arms control happened in order to make sure, now that we have eliminated the nuclear solution to the competition, to make sure that we don't have an inadvertent escalation and to stabilize the regime. So in that respect, it was very important. Now, out of fear of inadvertent escalation, one important movie came out, Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah.
It was inspired by what could have gone wrong during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it led to a scenario that actually we did have an inadvertent escalation. And what was the basis of the inadvertent escalation? Algorithmic programming, right? The doomsday machine was essentially a launch-all warning thing. And now, as you could correctly said, we are moving again toward the direction to inadvertent escalation because of artificial intelligence mostly, and the compression of lack of time in dealing with crisis. Responses have to be automatic. Now, another comment, I was fascinated by, you discover probably the most interesting speech of Pericles, which in my mind, it's that last speech and not the oratory of the dead. There, he really outlined what is leadership. He made a framework. As you said, it's not only vision, but also to know what to do. In other words, rational strategy. Not just vision, but also how to achieve this vision, how to achieve results, how to win, how to have a theory of victory. Like Pericles went in his audience, the Athenians, and said, look, we have the Spartans, and that's my theory of victory. And it's based in the analysis of the international system on the aims that we have, the means that we have, the ways that we will use our means. So he gave a very comprehensive theory of victory. But the second element of a leader, when it comes to prudence, which is our topic, is really control of emotions. To have rationality, you need to control emotions. And emotions can happen at two levels, both at the level of the leaders, fame, status, but also populism at the level of the population, nationalism. So there, Thucydides presented Pericles as the ideal leader that he could control the emotion of the people. You know, when they were becoming overtly risk-takers and aggressive, tries to cool them down. When they were pessimistic, try to raise the rhythm. So control of emotion via restraint. That's the key word, restraint. And if you look the under-theme of that speech of Kennedy, it's restraint. Let's have competition, but in a restrained way. And now I come to our current times. What are the lessons that we can draw from Cold War that are relevant today? It's managed competition. And I think the basic gist of the theme of Kennedy's speech is that managed competition, yes, we can compete. We are different. There are communists. But we can have a managed competition because there are areas that we have common interest. So it's not idealism, it's pure realism. We have common interest, so conflict coexists with cooperation. And let's develop cooperation. And actually they developed during the Cold War, arms control, as we said. The Non-Proliferation Treaty that, by the way, was based on very strong collaboration between the superpowers that created the preconditions to have the regime. Now, taking this managed competition today to the Chinese, because we are having a Cold War again. This managed competition in today's Cold War will mean that we are going to have geopolitical competition, economic competition, technological competition, ideological. That's in the cards. There are no way to get away with that. But how we can manage our common interest, and the superpowers, China and the United States, do have common interest. First of all, proliferation. I mean, it's not in the interest of China to have Japan and Korea, South Korea to have nuclear weapons, not so what's happening in Ukraine or Belarus or whatever. So they do have common interest. Second, arms control. Now, actually, in the era of artificial intelligence, arms control are more important because they have to control something that they cannot see. During the Cold War, they could calculate missiles, they could calculate now. They have to control algorithms, which is much more difficult. Pandemics. It's either a health problem or weapons of mass destruction problem, if it's biologically driven, if it's biological warfare. Environment. We discussed how you were surprised that Greece in the summer, the weather was funny. Well, environment is influencing everybody. And in case of the two great powers or two superpowers, financial stability, because they both have stake on financial stability. So what's the conclusion to control today? Both superpowers need to have restraint. They have to realize that they have to manage competition and cooperation at the same time. And as Kennedy said, empathy is critical. And in my last remark, now being a realist, I have to be a pessimist. I think, and maybe in an area that I will be a little more pessimist compared to you, I think the non-proliferation regime is collapsing. It's collapsing in a big way. Because the non-proliferation regime was based on cooperation of the two great powers, and now they don't cooperate. Second, in the treaty, there is explicitly the idea that everybody should reduce the use, the role of nuclear weapons. Now we can see in Ukraine, every day there are threats. And the third important element of the non-proliferation treaty is that the nuclear powers, they don't use threats against non-nuclear powers, right? That's what Russia is doing. So everything that was on the proliferation regime is collapsing, not to mention the other things, not transfer technology, how you are dealing with peaceful nuclear energy. So we are in front of our eyes, the non-proliferation regime is collapsing. And my prediction is very soon, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Japan will get into nuclear. Actually, some of them, they're already nuclear. In my mind, Japan has 200 tons of plutonium in this study. How long do you think it will take Japan to become nuclear?
Months.
Months? So you see, we are almost there. So how you stop countries like Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, Turkey to go nuclear? It needs the cooperation of the superpower, either by extended deterrence or they are increasing the cost of non-proliferation. But when they cooperate, this will not happen. And I think that's the #1 problem of today. And if Kennedy goes alive, I think in a speech today, we have given more emphasis in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Master, for stressing strain, I think for strain as the linking point between the communication and competition. And now we're turning to Professor Chen, who is an expert on US-China relations. China has come up a few times by our top experts here before. So perhaps this gloomy prospect that was brought by Professor Lapias is quite relevant in the discussion between the US and China today, and what JFK used to say, that total victory is impossible. And we cannot really fight politically with war today, since the nukes are there waiting for us. Is this the case regarding China and all the other discussion between decoupling, de-risking? The words are changing from one week to the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Babaciu. I would like to thank the Institute of International Relations in Greece and also Greece for inviting me to be here. I happen to be in Europe, and my colleague and also friend Vasilis told me that there's this very good event here happening at Athens, and I was so impressed with that. When Professor Babaciu introduced us, I think that we are all related to Tsinghua University. It's almost like we moved our classroom from Beijing to Athens. And I know Professor Babaciu hasn't been to Tsinghua before, but then you were at an online event with my colleague
Yes.
last year, right?
Yes.
So we also contribute as a friend of Tsinghua University. Okay. And thank you so much. And I'm not an expert in arms control or disarmament. My colleague Vivian in our department is a very specialized expert in that area. But then things that I have heard from Angela Kane's very good address. You have ambitious goals, but then you mentioned this practical approach to solve problems, and then leadership. If we combine all these things together, it means that the JFK's address still applies to today's work. What happened? Not necessarily, not only arms control disarmament, but also climate change, public health, things like these. So all these are global issues require global collaboration, cooperation, deals, things. So that is highlights the importance of looking at these global issues from the perspective of humanity instead of national citizens. And that shows how interconnected we are in the world affairs nowadays. Actually, I just want to mention, you mentioned US-China relations. Let me share you some of thoughts when I was on the flight from Hong Kong to Milan. Long before the age of globalization, we were already interconnected with each other, Greece and China. Why? For those of you who have been to Beijing, if you take a train 2 hours away from Beijing in the northern part of Shanxi province, there's the city of Datong, where you will find the Yundao caves, where this magnificent Buddha statues carved on the side of the mountain. those who come in the 4th and the 5th centuries, where there was this Northern Wei dynasty. The first 5 emperors were made into 5 huge Buddhas there. But then where did these skills come from? Greek, originally from Greek. Alexander the Great, his army went to the northwestern part of India, Gandhara. He brought the craftsman skills to that part of India. Now, by the time when Buddhism was eliminated from India, it went into part of Pakistan and the eastern part of Afghanistan, and in what was called the Persian Empire. And then through Central Asia, it came to China. So from the 4th and the 5th centuries, we made a lot of Buddhas. Now, if you look at the Buddhas today, if you go to Daton, look at all these Buddhas, they don't look like Chinese. They have big noses, and they are wearing Greek-style robes covering one shoulder, right? But if you happen to ask any Chinese standing in front of these Buddhas, tell me what you think of the Buddhas. Oh, they are so beautiful. They are so magnificent. This is really the Chinese way of what a Buddha should look like. But remember, this is a Greek way of depicting an Indian Buddha. So you see how our cultures were interconnected and then give these magnificent beauty that impressed not only Chinese, but please go to Daton and see yourself how Greek culture is there. And besides these interconnections of cultures, our imaginations have already been interconnected too. As Vasilis just briefly introduced, when I was engaging or in Shenzhen, talking about the U.S.-China relations, I always made my students to look at the map of the Greek peninsula 2,500 years ago. Read the history of Peloponnesian War. Why? Because people tend to link what was happening 2,500 years ago, what was happening here, to the modern day US-China relationship. And hence the word Thucydides trap. By the way, the professor, Graham Allison, made a lot of money from the Chinese market. But they're not giving us their eyes. So a lot of people think that, if we compare these to, histories, to what happened here in Greece and what is happening now in the US-China relationship, a lot of people imply some inevitability that this will lead to some conflicts, major conflicts. But then if you read the history of the Peloponnesian War in this wonderful book, thank you so much, on the Thucydides on strategy. I don't think Thucydides pointed to anything inevitable. I think this tragedy or this Peloponnesian War cannot be applied to the modern day US-China relationship. But anyway, I don't just want to point to where US-China relationship goes. I just want to say how our two countries, though far away from each other, how our imaginations have been. That's amazing. That is why I know the words that we are talking often today regarding US-China relations is entanglement, de-risking, how we should not be dealing with each other. But then too, at Tsinghua University, we still encourage our students to go abroad and to get some global visions and to think of themselves as a global citizen, to look at issues as a global citizen, to acquire these visions. That is why I and my colleagues from Tsinghua University came to Europe and then we visited the Polytechnic University of Milano, and then we're going to Technical University of Munich. We still want to encourage our students to go abroad, study, and also we also want new students from our partner universities to come to Beijing and Shenzhen, especially the city of the future for China. So again, in international relations, we tend to work for ambitious goals, but then we need practical approaches, and leadership is so crucial. Get this done. So that's my thoughts. Very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for stressing the connection of imaginations I noticed here, and our interconnected cultures that bring us to the same questions very often, despite the differences and despite the different views on the same issue. Now, let us finish this first cycle of discussions with Dr. Vasilis Rigas, and now we're pleased to reverse the table, to turn the table and ask you, start with the question, what prompted you to organize this discussion?
Thank you, Professor Blantu. It is the very distinguished guests that are here today. It's a very distinct privilege to be here. I know that this think tank and Hampton University and also Ipatos University have been incubators for many diplomats, Greeks, that they have tried to apply the lessons of leadership internationally. And I hope really that after this event, with so much deep insights that have already been expressed in this panel, from Angela Kane's speech to Professor Platias, Professor Anatopoulos, the wonderful historical and cultural osmosis that Professor Zhang presented, a lot of the future diplomats here would be really inspired to move the world like JFK did 60 years ago. So going back to your questions, it's very interesting. It's very interesting because it proves the importance of people-to-people exchanges and a little bit the institutional approach that I think it was you, Professor Anatopoulos, you mentioned in your speech. So what happened actually? Last November, I gave a faculty lecture at Tsinghua University. It was about the Thucydides trap, and basically I echoed your view that the Thucydides trap is a falsification of history, an oversimplification of analogies, and there's no inevitability anymore. And the conclusion of that lecture was JFK's speech for peace. Now, so I used that lecture to conclude and argue that there's no inevitability in war, that peace can be a process, and that actually the US won the Cold War because of avoiding it. It's a bit like an oxymoron and a paradox, but it's the, the reality of history. Now, very smart student, a Yale said, okay, rhetoric can be cheap. JFK delivered a beautiful speech, but what did he really achieve? Did he walk the walk, talk the talk, or walk the walk? And in fact, I hadn't thought about this, but it was, the interaction that an American student at Schwarzman College in Tsinghua University that made me think exactly about the delivery of leadership. And the delivery of leadership of that speech was the partial test battery. Now, the partial test battery did not only set the foundations for the era of arms controls, right? The Non-Proliferation Treaty and all the SALT and START treaties that followed, but it delivered immediate effects on making life gentle. What was that effect? Well, if you ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere, the carcinogenicity, radioactive particles decline, and that was measurable. So we had an immediate measurable effect of prudent leadership in practice, and that means lower cancer rate. So, making life gentle and making basically both the Soviets, the Americans, and the Europeans, the rest of the world enjoying the fruits of sovereign leadership. I would like to conclude by talking a little bit about the intellectual environment at the Sophrosyne College, because that was the incubator, the stimulus that inspired me to think of this event, and be very privileged to be here with a very distinguished guest, and Angela Kane. So the Sophrosyne College was established about 7 years ago. And the prescience of establishing an American college into the flagship university of China, the alma mater studiorum of President Xi Jinping, of President Hu Jintao, of Premier Zhu Rongji, one of the most successful prime ministers in China, was that some years down the road, that was 2014, so some years down the road, the relationship between China and the US is going to deteriorate. So the structural dimension was there. When you have a rising hegemonic power challenging the established hegemonic order of the ruling power, things become geopolitical. And so this geopolitical securitization, when Steve Schwarzman showed up at Tsinghua, was something that he had predicted. And the prediction was that some years down the road, the Americans and the Chinese would not talk to each other. And this is exactly what Angela Kane mentioned by saying that we have no arms controls, negotiations, all the established norms and treaties have collapsed. And so,
not even the hotline.
Not even the hot, exactly. Not even the Chinese defense minister is on the sanction list. I don't think that has happened in the Cold War. I don't think that I don't remember the Soviet defense minister to be in a US sanction. So they don't even talk. So it's true, the prescience of Steve Schwarzman and of Tsinghua University, that the two big guys, the head of states, the big negotiators would not talk to each other, would talk past each other, was very fun. So in hindsight, we know that was true. And so the Sophrosyne College basically invites Americans, Chinese, Europeans, young students with the potential to become prudent leaders, and facilitates the dialogue, facilitates the discussion. And I think that is the first step for the process of peace. And I think with his speech, JFK unleashed that process by inviting the Soviets to talk and by making sure to remind both the American side and the Soviet side that we're all fallible mortals. So let me conclude with that line, the idea that we're all mortals, because if we really fight a nuclear war, this is going to be very hard. So the issue here is not to fight it. And the only way to prevent that is prudent leadership, sovereign leadership. And, if you want to read one thing about this, read the speech and then go back to Thucydides and read the speeches in Thucydides, read Archidamus, read Pericles, and Hermocrates. So thank you so much, and it's a very distinct privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. I would like to give the floor again to Angela Kane to perhaps respond, react to the comments that have been said until now, and remind also that I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis changed Kennedy a lot, because we know that he was urging President Eisenhower before him to overcome the missile gap with the Soviet Union. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. And he was trying to alleviate his allies, and it was the de Gaulle, Kennedy de Gaulle reached the time taking place, 1963. It was exactly the time when the first de Gaulle veto was given to England towards the European community at that time. So perhaps we can
Because of the polarity.
the polarity is exactly it was the NATO disagreement. You see that history gets again, the history of the Cold War gets again into the picture, but since today we're talking a lot about nuclear disarmament and prudence at the same time, I'd also like to mention one phrase from that very important speech of JFK. He said, "We shall do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just." This is very Thucydidean. Please.
Thank you very much. And I must say that I've greatly profited from all of the comments that you have made, because I think it's been a very enriching discussion, and also the commentaries that you've given. And what I really take back from this, and I was really grateful for Vasilis for making that suggestion to focus on this speech, because we forget about leadership, because we don't see a lot of leadership in this world right now. And I think that we really need to be reminded. And when you think about the very soaring, the very ethical language that JFK had, it's really very impressive, because you don't hear that now either. I mean, how many speeches are you listening to that stir you as much as, for example, JFK's speech stirred? Now, there's a big difference between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the crisis that we have today. First of all, the Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days. Think about it, 13 days. Ukraine war started, what, 16 months ago now? I mean, that's a long time. And one of the things that I find that I took home also from the JFK experience of studying the speech is that basically you cannot have winners, only winners. It cannot be one wins and the other one loses. And in a way, he gave a down plank, if I can call it that. He gave a way out. He offered basically some suggestions on how to downgrade the crisis and basically made it a win for both sides. And that's something that you really have to realize. There has to be a win. And right now we're in a situation where both sides want to win. You know, Russia wants to win and the US wants to win, or NATO wants to win, the West wants to win. But we cannot have, you know, one winner and one loser. It's just not going to happen that way. And I don't know what the incentives are for the two sides to start sitting together. And I mean, two sides, yes, of course, it's Ukraine, but on the other hand, it's really between also Washington and Moscow. And the question that I have is, Anthony Blinken gave a very important speech a couple of days ago at an annual meeting of an arms control association in Washington, D.C. And he basically held out a hand to Russia and sort of said, we need to talk, and I'd like to talk. Now, there has to be more than that, because there has to be an offer of some thinking about what can actually be offered in these talks. Why would Russia start to talk with Washington? And I think that is something that, of course, we don't know. Maybe there were messages passed that are not known to us, that are basically under the table. But what we know now is that we don't have tools that are fit for the task. We don't have the instrumentarium, the toolkit that we have to deal with crisis is basically empty. We don't have an answer to what's going on now. We don't have a strategy. We don't have a leader who can actually take the initiative. And maybe with Blinken's effort, there's a possibility to overcome some of the difficulties. But on the other hand, something has to give, and no one really wants to give anything at this point. That is basically my biggest problem. And when it comes to leadership, it also rings true for me, because I wrote a chapter in a book of a study which I negotiated on the Middle East. And this was a Middle East negotiation that involved the US, the UK, the Russian Federation, and basically to create a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. And it cratered. And we were asked, the 4 principles were basically asked to say, what lessons did you take home from that? And one of my major issues, and I wrote this at the beginning of the year, actually, my major issue was we didn't have a strategy. We just went into this and we played it by ear, more or less. We reacted, but we didn't have a strategy to sort of say, what we want to achieve is a weapons of mass destruction free zone, but we have no way of getting there because we didn't have any outlines of the steps. We didn't really think about this. And when you have several people negotiating that are very powerful, it becomes very, very difficult to find agreement. And we found that we couldn't get agreement. What I'm missing now is, for example, of course, Kennedy, he was a leader in his own right, but he also had a majority of the American Congress and the Senate behind him. And you don't have that today anymore. I don't think that Biden has a lot of playroom to basically take proposals forward, to make proposals, because it's such a divided society right now internally. And the other problem is we're in 2023, there's going to be elections next year. So as far as the electoral calendar of the United States is concerned, we're already in a lame duck period, if you so want. So this is very, very difficult. And let me mention another example, which I find very interesting, because it also reminded me when I thought about Kennedy. Remember Obama? You know, Obama made huge proposals in 2009 when he spoke in Prague. And basically, it's like nuclear war. No, you know, I want to have a nuclear weapon-free world, and maybe not in my lifetime. But he made very powerful proposals as well, which stirred the nation. The unfortunate aspect was there wasn't much follow-up at all. It kind of all petered out in the end. I mean, it was very disappointing. But on the other hand, what he said in Prague, what he said in some of the speeches that he made at the time was very, very powerful. But there was no follow-through. Now, then you wonder, why was there no follow-through? Was it not? There was no agency among the people. I mean, we talked about the Kennedy speech. So what was the result of it? But he never followed really up on it. I mean, he didn't convince the people. He didn't convince others to follow his vision, because the vision was there, but it fell flat. And that was, I think, very, very, very disappointing. What I find regrettable now, and this is my last comment, is that right now what we're regressing to is punitive measures. Sanctions were mentioned. You know, this is one of the toolkits, sanctions. Now, what do you do with sanctions? You impose them, and you can make them stronger and stronger and stronger. Think North Korea. North Korea has the heaviest sanctions of any state in this world, and still they have not changed their policy. So it's a naming and shaming and sanctions, but once you've imposed sanctions, it's very hard to undo them. And so once you have these punitive measures, unless you have some incentive to cooperate, unless you have some incentive to actually talk to people, you're not going to get anywhere, because punitive measures and naming and shaming is not going to get an agreement. Because what you're trying to say is, I can basically last you out. You are going to crumble at some point in time. And I don't think that in these days that's going to happen. And as Kennedy sort of said, we all breathe the same air. And as we've recently seen in the east coast of the United States, we don't breathe very good air these days. We basically have to fix the environment, and that means that we have to actually work together, all of us. And that's one of the aspects that I think is going to be very preeminent in the next couple of years, in addition to the arms control. Thank you.
Our audience is made up of young leaders and older leaders, but I hope that the message gets through and can be more communicated. We need to gain awareness of the seriousness of the nuclear threat, because I think we've lived a long time in a nuclear security environment, thinking that this will never happen. But now it's there, and we can hear that from Russia, coming from Russia. So let's open the Q&A session. If I don't know your names, some of you I know and your affiliations, but please state them again for the video and for the speakers, and give your questions and say to whom they are directed. Thank you very much. Is there a microphone that can circulate to the audience? We have, let's take 3 questions in the beginning, and then you can comment on them.
Very much. Once you story I was today, although I was born and raised in this city, I don't know if any investment that I served the UN, also legal affairs, New York. Points, questions, or comments for you to comment. First, I'm pleasure and an honor presence of something like Kane, well known. I would say someone who inspired many in the United Nations and beyond, and played a positive role in the political and Islamic affairs. And of course, leaders from other Greek and Chinese universities. Leader is not a word that I would use for myself either. I retired from the UN as a principal officer, and have drafted a number of conventions and model laws for the UN. But I would start with something I learned from the then General Council of the UN, Karl August Leisler. Law and order is struggling, not only in the world, but also within the UN. And I will limit at that. Later, I will even cite him for several examples that he gave to his staff at the time. Similar, lawyer to the Sanctions Committee of the first Iraq war, another well-known lawyer, John Scott, South Africa, told us a number of stories about law and order and how they were applied or not applied in the decisions with respect to sanctions. But my points on the subject of the conference today are two. One is leadership and Sophrosyne, the word prudence. I read Aristotle's definition of Sophrosyne, let me be honest, and he gives a different definition. Holding our desires, controlling our passions, not becoming slave to pleasure, but living decently. I don't think that many leaders are up to that standard. The first, I would say, virtue behind definition of Sophrosyne, prudence or sobriety, Aristotle, is humility. And humility for most of political leaders in the world is complex, an inferiority complex. So I'm wondering whether we're talking about the ideal or the dream, the Himeric dream of the king philosopher, which never existed and will never exist. So that's my first point. My second point, several of the speakers made it, and Ms. Kane also made it, the concept of peace, JFK, and the concept of peace in the US and the world today. And I will just quote Mr. mentioned the concept of JFK. I would mention the concept of peace with that prevails in circles that are related to the project for the new American century through a policy of military strength and moral clarity. Or with a policy of the grand chessboard, American primacy and its geostrategic imperatives of Spigner presidency, or with a policy of clash of civilizations of Samuel Huntington. For many, civilizations do not clash, fanatic clash, and perhaps uncivilized people's clash, but not civilization. But that's another point. So much about the concept of peace, of JFK, and the concept of peace prevailing today. And I would limit at that because I have already perhaps abused the privilege of the yes.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
There's one on the left there.
There's one on the left, I think. Yes.
The climate crisis that you already mentioned, for example, in the East Coast. I would like to know to hear your thoughts actually about the alternative of nuclear energy. I think the nature of let me say this. Like not your thoughts on the preparation of nuclear energy, not as a way of having destruction, but as a way of actually selling that and helping to kill the environment.
Can you just speak up a little bit?
To evaluate nuclear energy.
About the theory of nuclear energy, not as a weapon of mass destruction, but as a way, as an alternative to fossil fuels, because this is actually in this present day age, nuclear energy has come up again as I feel very lack with academics, volunteers. So that's how you talk about that.
Other questions? Let's start with that.
Well, let me suggest that we use Sophrosyne in a way that Thucydides used it. And in Thucydides, and we have written extensively with Vasilis on that, it has three dimensions. One, rationality, means, sense, ways. Second, control of emotion and restraint. And third, and most importantly, control of luck and uncertainty to guide the ship of the state in the fog of uncertainty and competition. Aristotle picked one of these definitions out of that. It was in Thucydides and also in some of the classic poets. But Aristotle got only one of the three dimensions, the one that you mentioned, and then moved to Catholic religion. And now when we call Sophrosyne, it's the definition that we gave, but we give a much more extended definition of Sophrosyne. Now on the issue of nuclear energy, it's crystal clear that it's clean, and it's crystal clear that it's safe. But you should ask why making promises in the 50s and 60s, it never took off. If you look at the world's balance of energy, the energy mix, nuclear is 4 to 5%. And if you look at the projections in the next 30 years, it's still 4 to 5%. So nuclear doesn't take off when it's safe and it's clean. For two reasons. First, you cannot isolate it from proliferation. I mean, one of the reasons that the Americans tried to, although they promoted it in the beginning with atoms for peace, then they realized that this energy brings together the non-civilian uses, namely proliferation. So that's one of the basic reasons. The other reason is economics. You have to invest a lot of money up front, having a lot of risks. And you have to get your money back in 60 years. And the risks are institutional. I mean, Merkel, after Fukushima, changed the rule in Germany, and suddenly, you know, the whole nuclear industry had to gain. An accident could happen. A funny accident could happen in Kenya because the Africans, they don't know how to use it. And then you have a huge disaster, and every country in the world said, oh, it's suddenly is dangerous, and create this kind of risk. So institutional, legal risk, but most importantly, the economics. If you look, the money that you have to pay up front, and you have to wait 10 years to operate it, and then to expect 60 years that everything will go correct in order to get your money back, doesn't make sense. So if you see who is investing, it's not so much private companies, are states. I mean, the Chinese, they want to reduce their dependency. So they buy the way that they buy infrastructure, rather than being a kind of commercial project. And when the Russians manage to sell, like in Turkey, they take all the risk. If you see the deal with Turkey, it's the Russians that they build and operate, and Turkey just buys the energy. So the economics of nuclear energy are not right. That's why it hasn't taken off.
First of all, let me say that I'm very happy to greet a fellow UNer, so to say, who has lived in New York and in Vienna. And I must say that it's very rarely acknowledged how many important international treaties the UN was able to negotiate and conclude. And this is something that basically is taken for granted. People don't talk about it. Only when these treaties are somehow under threat of being extinct, then that's what you have. But international treaties very rarely have that. It's usually the bilateral treaties that are in danger of being coming apart. But I also wanted to come onto the nuclear power plants. And I think we have to rethink that a little bit. And I was, initially, I was in the 60s, I was demonstrating against nuclear power plants because there was one about 30 kilometers from where I grew up. This is basically, it's raising the temperature, it's going to, be terrible for the environment, and basically could be an accident and we could all be killed. And I think that it's right because Merkel did it, but that was also in a different era when we were not quite as concerned yet as we are now about the environment. But on the other hand, you will also recall that there were nuclear power plants that were built and then were dismantled. In Vienna, where I now live, there was one when it was under not the Czech Republic, but Czechoslovakia, that one right smack on the border with Austria. And basically that was taken down, after the Czech Republic and after the Cold War, the Iron Curtain fell apart. But what I am really worried about is that what is happening, because why does Saudi Arabia want to have nuclear power plants? And they're saying we need to diversify because the oil is coming to an end, the gas is coming to an end. But does that really justify it? And there's one fly in the ointment, and that is because basically what happens if you have a nuclear power plant and you need highly enriched uranium, you need to get it, you cannot enrich it yourself. Think about Iran right now. What they're doing is they're enriching uranium themselves to highly enriched uranium. It takes quite a while to have all the centrifuges, etc. So the highly enriched uranium is being given by certain HEU data banks. But Saudi Arabia says, no, we don't want that. We want to enrich the highly enriched uranium ourselves. We want to have that same process that we have. That's against regulations. There's actually a treaty that basically says you can't do that. And then you wonder, they're now appealing very strongly to Biden, and there is going to be more talk between the Saudis and the United States, because General Electric has made a bid to build that nuclear power plant, one of the nuclear power plants. Rosatom has also made a bid to build the nuclear power plant. So the thing is that basically Biden is being appealed to by the Saudis to sort of say, you have to allow us to enrich this, meaning you have to make an exemption to that treaty, which not that many countries belong to. I find that is highly dubious as a strategy, because I wonder what's behind that. And you had mentioned earlier in your statement that, for example, Japan, South Korea, they have already large stores of highly enriched uranium, which is unusual for a country that doesn't have nuclear powers, nuclear weapons.
And plutonium in case of Japan.
And plutonium in case of Japan. And what you have, very interestingly, you have a prime minister who actually grew up in Hiroshima. So he's very much pro-disarmament. He's very much against nuclear weapons. Whether this is possible for him to prevail. I belong to this group of international group of eminent persons against nuclear weapons, IJEP it's called. But anyway, what happened in the G7, if you notice, I quoted the G20, which was a very strong statement against nuclear weapons from the G20, which included Russia. The one, the G7, was only nuclear weapons in the context of Russia. It didn't at all talk about a larger, we don't want nuclear weapons. It was, or we want nuclear disarmament. It was only in the context of Russia. So the whole narrative is really changing right now. And the narrative that I worry about is changing is with countries like Saudi Arabia wanting to have the enrichment and also to have nuclear power plants that are exempt from the stability that right now this treaty gives it in order not to have that. And we haven't even talked about Iran, because the Iran deal is another one that's fallen apart. I don't think that can be revived at this point. So what's the incentive for Iran not to develop nuclear weapons? Are they going to stop just shy of it until they have maybe like another month or so before they can trot it out? So I think that this is something we really have to keep. But there's no incentive for Iran, because whatever incentive there is has evaporated when Trump left it. And the Europeans who tried very hard to give assistance in terms of to defeat the SWIFT system, the sanctions for the US dollar, etc., were not able to deliver on that deal. And that's why Iran basically went its own way and started enriching with the centrifuges again. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the subtext of today's conference, if you want to call it, is leadership and the question of agents, but it's not just agency, it's also staff. And I think Machiavelli, somewhere in his work in the Discourse Society, tried to address this dilemma between agent and structure. And he said that, hard times provide good leaders. Good leaders provide good times. Good times give us bad leaders, and bad leaders bring us to hard times. And if you look, you don't need to go back to ancient Greek history. I mean, if you look at contemporary American history, look at what happened after 1945. The war generation produced the so-called liberal order. They built this nexus of institutions, these practices and principles that became the Western liberal order, that became then the liberal order, right? This was enlightened leadership that was a product of the Second World War. Look at what happened after the end of the Cold War. Again, enlightened leadership, and I'm talking mainly about the Bush-Senior administration, managed to unite the divided Europe and to reunify Germany, right? But then hubris came. And hubris was brought by good times. You mentioned the neocons with their doctrine of preemptive war and so on and so forth. But hubris occurred from the other side of the political spectrum as well. The Democrats and the liberals abandoned the Stalin order. They talked about humanitarian interventions, right? And then we had Kosovo. And the crisis of Kosovo was handled in a catastrophic way. Look at the difference between the handling of the crisis of the first Iraq war. They rolled back aggression from Kuwait, but they stopped short of invading Iraq and bringing about regime change. The second Iraq war was different. And then we had the meeting of strange bedfellows. Liberals, on the one hand, like Christopher Hitchens, public intellectuals, would agree with the regime change in Iraq, and the neocons said that we need to exercise the access of leaders to preemptive wars. And where did that lead us? To nuclear proliferation. Why? Because countries like Iran, Turkey, North Korea, they said that we don't want to have the fate of Saddam Hussein, we don't want to have the fate of Gaddafi. So let's acquire nuclear weapons. So everyone is trying to acquire nuclear weapons. So I think leadership with all the indicators that Vasily and Thanasi have outlined, with prudence, with Sophrosyne, and I would argue, a couple of more like moderation or proportionality and rationality. It's what happened after 9/11 was the opposite of proportionality and rationality. Instead of having a punitive punishment of the aggressors, of the terrorist aggressors, you declared war against terror. That was disproportionate. And the end result was the strategic overextension of the United States. So in the end, leadership plays a role, but also the structure within which leadership occurs. If I can differ a little bit with Thanasi on the Kennedy issue, is that, and I failed to mention the fourth audience, that was the domestic audience. And Kennedy, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and all his government, really tried to hush the issue of the Jupiter missiles for a long period of time. And when that came up, they tried to dismiss it as some outdated missiles that we were going to retire, to withdraw in any case, and so on and so forth. Kennedy created an environment of a winner, regardless of the fact that he had allowed Khrushchev to believe that he had entered a compromise. But in his domestic audience, Kennedy had emerged as a winner, and he needed to emerge in that way so that he can take such a stance vis-a-vis all the hawks and the hardliners in his domestic audience. Some people like Barry Goldwater that came out dismissing Kennedy's speech and so on and so forth, and the hawks in Congress and the Senate. So agency of course is important, but as Machiavelli very poignantly pointed out, this cycle of this dialectic of agent and structure, plays a very important role. How agency occurs in what environment and how effective it can be.
I'm not an expert in these fields, but the question reminded me of what Liesheim criticized and said different. If I read the book, reread the book, I find that book very inspiring. I think he corresponds to the King philosopher. Oh, by the way, actually, the question of this nuclear energy. That actually, I have a question for Angie, a hypothetical question. What would happen? What would have happened to the framework agreement if Al Gore had won the Disarmament? The 1994 framework agreement between Moscow and what would have happened if Al Gore had won the election to some
Al Gore had won the election. If Al Gore. Oh, Al Gore.
Yeah. Very confident.
Counterfactual.
Please just wrote a thing about
Okay, the what if in the end?
So just very quickly, philosopher King Plato, we're anti-Plato, we're more in the softest dimension of leadership. But you have to think of a leader is never alone. He's surrounded by advisors. And public life, grand strategy is very complex issue. So Kennedy was prudent because he surrounded himself by people like Robert Kennedy, his brother, who was truly brilliant and prudent, and Ted Sorensen. In fact, Ted Sorensen was a speechwriter, right? So we have to recognize this guy too, right? So I think in the definition of prudence, going back to George Danji and even McNamara and so on. So when you're a prudent leader, you pique your advisors very wise. I think that's the first step in building an executive team, surrounding yourself with sages, other philosopher teams that makes you perhaps a little bit more philosophical and kingly. Okay, thank you.
Yes. This JFK followed the doctrine saying, if you're the smartest in the room, you're in the wrong room. So, sounding like.
Yeah, thank you. Theoretical question. What would have happened if Al Gore had won? I can add a couple more. What would have happened if Hillary Clinton had won and not Trump? There can be there. What would have happened if Angela Merkel had done another, tour in the government? Even though she couldn't. I know, but there are a lot of questions, a lot of hypothetical questions that one could pose. What would have happened? And it's interesting to think about that. But on the other hand, here we are stuck with who was elected, and whether it was a slim election or whether it was won by a big margin. We don't know. I worry now about what happens next year. Because I don't know. I read about the judges been appointed to deal with the Trump accusations as it comes through. I worry about the political dimension of the whole division in the society, and I think that is really bad for the world. It's not only bad for the United States, but it's bad for the world because whoever comes out of it is going to be a leader of one side and not of the nation as a whole. And that to me is a frightening prospect because we've already seen what has happened in the last couple of years. And it would be really a shame if they were to continue, but I don't really see a way out. And we would like to say something else, and that is that if you think about it, autocratic leaders are really appealing to people. They get elected, and Erdogan is one of them, for example, and we know a lot more. The Economist Intelligence Unit, they always put out a listing of democratic states, and if you read that, 2022, they were like few that were fully democracies, full democracies. I think there were 18 of them, but they were like nearly half of them that were flawed democracies or autocracies. That to me is really worrisome because that's a trend that if you compare that to it may, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, was not the same. Unless you discount, of course, what happened in the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, etc. They were all autocratic states. But on the other hand, I find that deeply worrisome. And I just wonder, we're here, university, they're younger people. I don't know what you want to see. I don't know what your agency is in interfering in all of these issues. But I think there has to be a rethinking of what does it mean. I think you were the one who mentioned humility. I don't know that there are a lot of politicians who are humble. I'm sorry. I think we could all agree on that. And then on the other hand, I mean, does it take a certain humility to be a leader? In a way, I think it does, because you have to recognize that you can't always be the big winner of all of this. I'm going to give you one example because you talked about me as being a practitioner. I'll give you one example which I had a real problem with. In 2006, I was asked by Kofi Annan to negotiate the treaty between the United Nations and NATO. And I declined. I said, I can't do that. And he said, why can't you do that? I'm ordering you. So yes, I'm a good foot soldier, and yes, I did it. So I negotiated that treaty. But you know what my problem with that was? In 2006, we still had the Warsaw Treaty Organization. And I said, the United Nations is an international organization, basically dealing with all states of the world. Why are we negotiating a treaty with a military alliance? We should not be negotiating a treaty with a military alliance. And I said, if we do that, then at least let's hold out the hand and negotiate a treaty with the Warsaw Treaty Organization. I mean, I don't know, memorandum. And I lost that. I was basically ordered to do that. I did it. I grit my teeth, and we talked about NATO earlier. I grit my teeth and I negotiated. I still think it was a terrible decision because all it did, it was alienated Russia. It alienated whoever was in that camp. And it was just not a very good decision. So that was one of the things that I can share with you, being a practitioner, where you do something because you're ordered to do it, hate it because you know it's wrong. And in the end, it did not turn out to be in a good way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's wonderful that you made this talk here today. Perhaps we need another panel discussion about the erosion of democracy in today's world, which will be very interesting for our students here. I'm sure they would love to be your students at Sciences Po, Tsinghua, wherever you will teach, having this mixture of an intellectual and a practitioner. I'd like to thank you very much. I'm deeply thankful for that. I now would like to thank Professor Plakias, Professor Vantopoulos, Professor Chan, Dr. will be Professor Rodriguez, Sinon Feduli, the Executive Director of the Institute for International Relations, who organized all this and was wonderful in the entire preparation of the event. And of course, all of you distinguished guests that were here with us tonight in this panel discussion, which we all believe that will accompany you in the next days and weeks to come with more thought on that. Thank you very much.